The autumn night settled over the quiet streets of Millbrook Heights, an affluent neighborhood where colonial-style homes stood like silent guardians behind perfectly manicured lawns. At 10:45 p.m., Judge Sarah Monroe's sleek black Mercedes glided smoothly along Oakwood Drive, her thoughts still lingering on the pleasant evening spent at her sister's house celebrating her niece's academic achievements. Sarah had spent 15 years building her career in law, eventually earning her position as a superior court judge at the age of 42. Her reputation for fairness and thorough understanding of the law had earned her the respect of her colleagues and the legal community. Tonight, dressed in a casual but elegant navy blue pantsuit, she looked forward to reviewing case files in the comfort of her home office. The flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror caught her by surprise. Sarah checked her speedometer. She had been driving exactly at the speed limit. Her turn signals had been used properly, and her vehicle registration was current. With the practiced calm that came from years on the bench, she guided her car to the side of the road, positioning it perfectly between the white line and the curb. Following standard protocol that she had witnessed countless times in her courtroom, Sarah kept her hands visible on the steering wheel. She watched in her side mirror as two officers emerged from their patrol car, their flashlights casting long beams through the darkness. The way they approached her vehicle, aggressive stances, hands hovering near their weapons, seemed unnecessarily cautious for a routine traffic stop. "This isn't right," Sarah thought to herself, maintaining her composure as she observed their behavior with the analytical mind of a judge. Officer James Barrett, a stocky man with close-cropped blonde hair, approached the driver's side while his partner, Officer Michael Reynolds, a taller, younger officer with a military-style haircut, took position near the rear of her vehicle. "License and registration," Officer Barrett barked, his flashlight beam intentionally angled to shine directly in her eyes. The hostile tone in his voice was unmistakable. "Of course, officer," Sarah replied calmly, her voice carrying the measured tone she used in her courtroom. "I'm going to reach for my purse in the passenger seat to get my license, and then I'll retrieve the registration from the glove compartment." "Just hurry up," Barrett snapped, his impatience evident in every word. "What are you doing in this neighborhood anyway?" Sarah carefully extracted her license from her wallet and reached for the glove compartment, maintaining deliberate, slow movements. "I live in this neighborhood, officer. I'm returning home from my sister's house." Officer Barrett snatched the documents from her hand, studying them with obvious skepticism. "This your car?" he questioned, his tone suggesting he'd already made assumptions about her presence in this upscale area. "Yes, it is," Sarah responded, maintaining her dignified demeanor despite the growing tension. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Officer Reynolds had moved closer now, his flashlight beam scanning the interior of her vehicle. "Nice car for someone like you," he commented, the implication in his words clear and cutting. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly, but her expression remained neutral, a skill honed through years of presiding over emotionally charged cases. She was acutely aware that this situation was escalating beyond a simple traffic stop, and her years of legal experience told her to document every detail mentally. "Officers, I provided my license and registration as requested. Could you please tell me the reason for this stop?" she asked again, her voice firm but professional. Instead of answering, Officer Barrett turned to his partner. "Reynolds, what do you think? Something doesn't feel right here." "Step out of the vehicle," Reynolds commanded, his hand now resting on his holstered weapon. Sarah recognized the dangerous trajectory of these events. As both a judge and a black woman, she understood that her next actions would be crucial. She silently activated the voice recorder on her phone, which was sitting in the center console, another habit she had developed over years of experiencing similar situations, though none quite as blatant as this. As she prepared to exit her vehicle with the same dignity she carried into her courtroom each day, Sarah couldn't have known that this traffic stop would soon become a catalyst for change in the Millbrook Police Department. For now, she was simply another black woman being profiled by officers who had yet to realize they were about to make the biggest mistake of their careers. Sarah's hand moved slowly toward her car door handle, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. The cool night air rushed in as she stepped out, standing tall in her professional attire. Officer Barrett quickly moved into her personal space, while Officer Reynolds maintained his position with his hands still resting on his weapon. "Hands where we can see them," Barrett commanded, despite Sarah's hands being clearly visible at her sides. The streetlight above cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the sneer that had formed on his lips. "Officers, I want to understand the reason for this stop," Sarah stated firmly, her courtroom authority naturally flowing into her voice. "I was driving within the speed limit and following all traffic laws." Barrett circled her like a predator, his flashlight beam moving from her face to her expensive shoes. "You know, we've had reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood. A lot of high-end vehicles being stolen lately." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she maintained her composure. Years of handling heated courtroom exchanges had taught her the power of controlled responses. "I assure you, this is my vehicle. As my registration shows, I live at 1442 Oakwood Drive, just 3 blocks from here." "Anyone can fake papers," Reynolds interjected, moving closer. "How about you tell us what you're really doing in this neighborhood?" The situation was becoming increasingly hostile, and Sarah could sense the officers' predetermined assumptions clouding their judgment. She reached into her jacket pocket, saying, "Let me show you my business card." "Don't move," Barrett shouted, suddenly grabbing her arm. "Keep your hands where we can see them." "Officer, you're hurting me," Sarah stated clearly, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "I was reaching for my judicial identification." "Sure you were," Reynolds scoffed, now standing directly in front of her. "Listen, lady, we've heard every story in the book. Just because you're dressed fancy doesn't mean we're buying it." Sarah took a deep breath, her legal mind documenting every word and action. "I am informing you that I am Judge Sarah Monroe of the Superior Court. If you check my judicial identification—" "Oh, now you're a judge," Barrett laughed, tightening his grip on her arm. "And I'm the President of the United States. Reynolds, you hearing this?" Reynolds joined in the mocking laughter. "Yeah, and I'm the Pope. Ma'am, impersonating a judge is a serious offense." The absurdity of the situation might have been almost comical if it weren't so dangerous. Sarah could feel her pulse quickening, but her voice remained steady. "Officers, you're making a serious mistake. I demand to speak with your supervising officer." "You're not in a position to demand anything," Barrett growled, pulling her toward the patrol car. "In fact, your attitude is making me think you're hiding something more serious." Sarah noticed a car slowing down as it passed, the driver clearly concerned about what they were witnessing. She made eye contact briefly, hoping they would report what they were seeing. "I am exercising my right to remain silent," Sarah announced clearly, loud enough for any potential witnesses to hear. "I am also informing you that your actions are being recorded." This seemed to anger Barrett further. "Recording us, huh? That's it. You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest." "I have not resisted in any way," Sarah stated firmly, her words measured and precise. "And I remind you that as law enforcement officers, you are required to identify the reason for my detention." Reynolds pulled out his handcuffs, the metal glinting under the streetlight. "You really don't know when to shut up, do you?" As the cold metal of the handcuffs closed around her wrists, Sarah stood straight, her dignity intact. She could feel the rough handling of the officers as they pushed her toward their patrol car, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her struggle or plead. "Everything you're doing is being documented," she reminded them calmly. "And I can assure you, this will be thoroughly reviewed." "Save it for the holding cell," Barrett sneered, pushing her head down as they forced her into the back of the patrol car. As the door slammed shut, Sarah sat upright in the confined space, her mind already mapping out the legal proceedings that would follow this incident. These officers had no idea that their night of discriminatory policing was about to become a turning point in their careers, and not in the way they expected. Through the partition, she could hear them laughing and making comments about entitled people who don't know their place. Little did they know, they had just arrested the very person who would be reviewing police conduct cases in their district next week. The patrol car wound through the quiet streets of Millbrook Heights, taking a deliberately long route to the police station. In the back seat, Sarah sat perfectly still, her trained legal mind recording every turn, every stop, and every word exchanged between Officers Barrett and Reynolds in the front seat. "Maybe we should take the scenic route," Barrett chuckled from behind the wheel. "Give our guest here a proper tour of the neighborhood she claims to live in." Reynolds turned around in his seat, shining his flashlight directly at Sarah's face. "You know, most car thieves we catch aren't dressed this fancy. Got to give you credit for commitment to the role. Sarah remained silent, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The digital clock on the patrol car's dashboard read 11:23 p.m. She made a mental note of the time, another detail to add to what would soon become a formal complaint. "What's wrong?" Barrett called out mockingly. "Lost that judge attitude already? No more fancy legal talk." Through the mesh partition, Sarah could see them exchanging smug glances. She thought about her morning docket, about the cases waiting on her desk, about her clerk who would be wondering where she was when she didn't show up for the 9 a.m. hearing. The car suddenly swerved sharply, causing Sarah to slam against the door. Her handcuffs bit into her wrists, but she refused to show any discomfort. "Oops," Barrett said with fake concern. "These roads can be tricky at night." As they approached the police station, Sarah noticed the dashcam light was off. Another detail for the record. The building's harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the parking lot as they pulled in, the clock now showing 11:45 p.m., a 30-minute drive for what should have been a 10-minute journey. Officer Reynolds opened the back door, roughly pulling Sarah out by her arm. "Welcome to your new accommodations, Your Honor," he sneered, emphasizing the title with obvious sarcasm. Inside the station, a few officers looked up from their desks, their expressions ranging from curiosity to indifference. Sarah recognized several faces, officers who had testified in her courtroom, though none seemed to recognize her in this context. "Got a live one here," Barrett announced to the booking sergeant, a heavy-set man named Thompson. "Claims she's a judge, if you can believe it." Thompson barely looked up from his computer. "Charges? Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and will add suspicious activity in a residential area," Reynolds replied, still gripping Sarah's arm unnecessarily tight. "I need to make a phone call," Sarah stated firmly, breaking her silence. Barrett laughed. "Oh, now she speaks. Who you gonna call? The Supreme Court?" "Actually," Sarah responded calmly, "I was going to call Chief Justice Martinez. He's expecting me at the judicial conference tomorrow morning." Something in her tone made Thompson look up properly for the first time. He studied her face more carefully, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "Book her," Barrett interrupted, pushing Sarah toward the fingerprinting station. "We'll sort out her stories later." The fingerprinting process was deliberately rough, with the officer pressing her fingers harder than necessary into the ink pad. Sarah remained dignified, her mind cataloging each unnecessary use of force, each procedural violation. "Name?" the booking officer asked mechanically. "Judge Sarah Monroe, Superior Court, 3rd District," she replied clearly, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. The booking officer paused for a fraction of a second, but continued under Barrett's stern gaze. Sarah was photographed, her elegant outfit and composed expression a stark contrast to the usual mugshots taken in this room. "Cell 3 is open," Thompson called out, still looking somewhat uncertain. As they led her toward the holding cells, Sarah spoke again, her voice carrying the authority that had made her known for maintaining order in her courtroom. "Officers, I want the record to show that I have requested a phone call and have identified myself as a judicial officer. Your actions tonight will be reviewed." "Keep dreaming, lady," Barrett scoffed, but Sarah noticed his partner Reynolds shifting uncomfortably for the first time. The cell door clanged shut, its metallic echo resonating through the corridor. Sarah sat on the hard bench, her back straight, her expression unchanged. Through the bars, she could see Barrett and Reynolds laughing as they filled out their report, unaware that their careers were hanging by a thread. In just a few hours, the morning shift would arrive, and with it, the revelation that would turn this station upside down. For now, Sarah waited patiently, knowing that justice, true justice, often required perfect timing. The holding cell was cold, its harsh fluorescent lights casting unflattering shadows across the concrete walls. Sarah sat perfectly still on the metal bench, her keen eyes observing everything around her. The clock on the wall outside her cell showed 1:15 a.m., each tick echoing through the quiet corridor. 2 cells down, a young woman was crying softly. Sarah had noticed her earlier, barely 20, arrested for what sounded like a minor shoplifting charge. The girl's sobs painted a clear picture of the fear and uncertainty that these cells were designed to inspire. "Hey, Judge Lady," Officer Barrett's voice came mockingly through the corridor as he passed by on his hourly check. How's the presidential suite treating you? Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she focused on the small details: the camera in the corner with its blinking red light, the water stain on the ceiling that looked suspiciously like mold, the outdated fire safety posting that should have been replaced months ago. Each observation was another point to be addressed when this was over. Around 2 a.m., a new shift of officers arrived. Sarah watched their interactions through the cell bars, noting how some of them glanced at her with curiosity. She could hear snippets of their conversation. "That's the one claiming to be a judge," one whispered. "Barrett says she's probably involved in that car theft ring," another responded. "Something seems off about this one," a third officer muttered, looking uncomfortable. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, remembering the last case she had presided over involving police misconduct. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very department she had urged to implement better training procedures was now providing a first-hand demonstration of why that training was so desperately needed. At 3 a.m., Officer Reynolds returned, his earlier bravado somewhat diminished. "Do you want some water?" he asked, his tone notably less hostile than before. "No, thank you," Sarah replied calmly, maintaining her dignified composure. "But I would like to note that this is the first time I've been offered water since my arrest 3 hours ago." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Something about her continued poise was clearly bothering him. "Listen, if you're really who you say you are—" "Officer Reynolds," Sarah interrupted quietly, "I suggest you carefully consider your next words. They may be important later." He closed his mouth abruptly and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. The young woman in the other cell had stopped crying, now watching Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Sarah caught her eye and gave her a reassuring nod. In that moment, she was reminded why she had become a judge: to ensure justice was served fairly, regardless of circumstances. Around 4 a.m., the station began showing signs of early morning activity. Sarah could hear the night shift preparing to hand over to the morning crew. She listened carefully to the conversations floating down the corridor. "Did anyone run a proper check on the woman in cell 5? A new voice asked. "Barrett said she was lying about being a judge," came the response. "Yeah, but did anyone actually verify that?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The wheels were finally starting to turn. At 4:30 a.m., she heard hurried footsteps approaching her cell. A senior officer she recognized from her courtroom appeared, his face pale with recognition. "Judge Monroe," he stammered, clearly shocked. Sarah stood up slowly, brushing off her now wrinkled pantsuit. "Good morning, Officer Chen. I believe we last saw each other during the Martinez hearing last month." The corridor erupted into frantic activity. Officer Chen's radio crackled with urgent messages. Sarah could hear Barrett and Reynolds being called in from their patrol. The station captain's name was mentioned repeatedly. "Judge Monroe, hi. There's been a terrible mistake," Officer Chen managed to say, fumbling with the cell keys. "Yes," Sarah replied calmly, "there has been, and we're going to address it properly, through the appropriate channels." As the cell door opened, Sarah stepped out with the same dignity she carried onto her bench each morning. The holding area had filled with officers, their faces showing varying degrees of horror as they realized what had transpired. Through a window, she could see the first rays of dawn breaking over the city. In a few hours, she would be sitting on her bench, presiding over cases as usual. But this night would not be forgotten. It would become a catalyst for the changes she had long advocated for. As she was led to the captain's office, Sarah spotted Officers Barrett and Reynolds arriving, their faces draining of color as they recognized her in the morning light. Their long night was over, but their real troubles were just beginning. The police station captain's office buzzed with nervous energy at 5:45 a.m. Captain David Marshall sat behind his desk, his face ashen as he reviewed the arrest report in front of him. 23 years on the force hadn't prepared him for a situation quite like this. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said, looking up at Officers Barrett and Reynolds, who stood rigidly at attention. "You arrested a Superior Court judge on suspicion of car theft, without running her ID, without calling for verification, and without granting her a phone call." The officers remained silent, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. Through the office window, they could see Judge Monroe sitting in the conference room across the hall, calmly sipping the coffee that Officer Chen had practically sprinted to get her. "Sir, we didn't know," Barrett began. "Exactly. Captain Marshall exploded, slamming his hand on the desk. You didn't know because you didn't bother to check. Do you have any idea what you've done? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Captain, she was in a high-end vehicle in an area where we've had reports. She lives in that area. Marshall cut him off. Something you would have known if you'd spent 30 seconds doing your job properly instead of. He glanced at the report again, his face darkening, taking a scenic route to the station. Outside the office, the morning shift was arriving to find the station in barely controlled chaos. Word had spread quickly. Judge Sarah Monroe, known for her strict handling of police misconduct cases, had spent the night in their holding cell. Sergeant Thompson, who had been on booking duty, approached the conference room cautiously. Judge Monroe, I want to express my deepest apologies for last night's events. Sarah looked up from her coffee, her expression neutral. Sergeant, I noticed the camera in cell 5 appears to be malfunctioning. How long has that been an issue? Thompson's face fell. Even now, she was mentally documenting violations. Back in the captain's office, Marshall was on the phone with the police commissioner, his free hand massaging his temples. Yes, sir. No, sir. I understand the severity. Yes, she's still here. No, she hasn't contacted her office yet. Barrett and Reynolds stood frozen, watching their careers crumble before their eyes. Through the window, they could see more senior officials arriving at the station, their faces grave. The Chief Justice is on his way, Marshall announced, hanging up the phone. Judge Monroe was supposed to be leading a judicial panel on police reform this morning, a panel that, ironically, you two were scheduled to testify at next week. The station's legal affairs officer burst into the office, clutching a stack of papers. Captain, I've reviewed the bodycam footage. It's bad. They turned them off halfway through the stop. Marshall's face turned an even darker shade of red. Get out, he ordered the officers. Wait in the briefing room, and pray that Judge Monroe is feeling more professional than you were last night. In the conference room, Sarah was writing detailed notes on a legal pad. Several high-ranking officers hovered nearby, offering fresh coffee and breakfast, which she politely declined. Judge Monroe. Chief Justice Martinez called out as he strode into the station, his usual dignified demeanor tinged with concern. Are you all right? Sarah stood to greet him, her composure unwavering. I'm fine, Robert. Though I believe we'll need to revise the content of today's police conduct seminar. The Chief Justice's eyes narrowed as he took in her wrinkled clothes and the lingering marks from the handcuffs on her wrists. This is completely unacceptable. On the contrary, Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent station. This has provided valuable insight into exactly why our reform proposals are necessary. She gathered her notes and straightened her jacket. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a 9 a.m. hearing to prepare for. I trust the officers involved will be present in my courtroom when called. The station watched in collective silence as Judge Monroe walked out, head held high. As the door closed behind her, Captain Marshall turned to his assembled officers. Well, he said grimly, I hope you're all ready for some changes around here, because after tonight, they're coming whether we like it or not. In the briefing room, Officers Barrett and Reynolds sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the full magnitude of their actions. Their night of discriminatory policing had just become a watershed moment for the entire department, though not in the way they had ever imagined. 3 days after the incident, the marble halls of the 3rd District Courthouse buzzed with unusual energy. Word had spread quickly through the legal community about Judge Monroe's wrongful arrest, though she had returned to her duties without missing a single session. Officers Barrett and Reynolds stood nervously in the courthouse corridor, dressed in their formal uniforms. They were scheduled to testify in what should have been a routine drug possession case, unaware of who would be presiding over the hearing. Look sharp, their sergeant whispered, adjusting Barrett's collar. And for God's sake, stay professional. We don't need any more problems this week. The courthouse regulars, lawyers, clerks, and bailiffs hurried past them, some hiding knowing smiles. The officers remained oblivious to the whispers and meaningful glances being exchanged around them. Inside courtroom 304, Sarah's clerk, Michael Chen, arranged the day's files on the bench with particular care. He had witnessed his boss's remarkable composure over the past few days, as she continued her duties without a single mention of her night in custody. All rise, the bailiff announced as the clock struck 10 a.m. The courtroom doors opened, and Sarah entered in her judicial robes, her posture perfect, her expression serene. She took her seat at the bench, surveying the courtroom with her usual careful attention. "Be seated," she commanded, her voice carrying the same authority it always had. "We'll begin with case number 2025 CR 1432, State versus Thompson." Outside in the hallway, Barrett and Reynolds waited their turn to testify, reviewing their notes about the drug case. Their sergeant paced nervously, checking his watch every few minutes. "Remember," he coached them, "just stick to the facts. No editorializing, no assumptions, straight and professional." Inside the courtroom, the first case proceeded smoothly. Sarah handled each matter with her characteristic thoroughness, showing no sign that anything unusual had occurred that week. "Next case," she announced, shuffling her papers. "State versus Martinez, case number 2025 CR 1445. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors. "Officer Barrett and Officer Reynolds, you're needed for testimony." The two officers straightened their uniforms one final time and strode toward the courtroom doors. Their sergeant crossed his fingers, muttering a quiet prayer under his breath. As they pushed through the heavy wooden doors, the courtroom's atmosphere seemed to thicken. Regular attendees leaned forward in their seats, attorneys exchanged knowing looks, and the court reporter's fingers hovered expectantly over her keyboard. "Officers," the bailiff directed them, "please approach the witness stand." Barrett led the way, his boots clicking against the polished floor. Both officers kept their eyes forward, not yet looking up at the bench. "State your names and badges for the record," came the clear, familiar voice from the bench. Barrett's step faltered. Reynolds nearly walked into him. Slowly, they raised their eyes to the bench, where Judge Sarah Monroe sat watching them with an unreadable expression. "I asked for your names and badges, officers," she repeated calmly, as if she had never seen them before. Barrett's mouth opened and closed silently. Reynolds had gone pale, his hands gripping the railing of the witness box. "Officer James Barrett," he finally managed, his voice barely audible. "Badge number 4572. "Officer Michael Reynolds," his partner followed. "Badge number 6891. Sarah nodded, making a note in her file. "Thank you, officers. Now, regarding the arrest of Mr. Martinez on the night of February 4th, please describe the circumstances that led to his detention." The courtroom held its collective breath. Every person present knew about the recent incident, yet here was Judge Monroe, conducting business as if nothing had happened, showing these officers the professional courtesy they had denied her. Barrett wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. Reynolds stared straight ahead, his face a mask of discomfort. Their sergeant, watching from the back of the courtroom, closed his eyes in anticipation of what might come next. But Sarah simply waited, pen poised over her notepad, ready to hear their testimony about a completely unrelated case. Her expression remained neutral, professional, and utterly unaffected by the drama unfolding before her. This, perhaps, was the most powerful message she could send: that justice would be served equally and fairly in her courtroom, regardless of personal history. The officers who had treated her with such contempt would receive the same professional consideration she gave to everyone who appeared before her bench. The irony of the situation was lost on no one present, except perhaps the defendant, who wondered why his routine drug possession hearing had the entire courtroom on the edge of their seats. Sweat trickled down Officer Barrett's neck as he tried to focus on his testimony. His voice wavered as he recounted the details of the Martinez drug arrest, painfully aware of Judge Monroe's steady gaze from the bench. "And after discovering the suspicious package, we proceeded to..." Barrett's voice trailed off as Judge Monroe raised her hand slightly, a gesture he had seen her use countless times in court before, though never fully appreciated until now. "Officer Barrett," she spoke, her voice carrying the same measured tone she had used during her arrest, "please speak into the microphone. The court reporter needs to hear your testimony clearly." Reynolds stood rigid beside his partner, his complexion ashen. The irony was suffocating. Just 3 nights ago, they had mockingly called her Your Honor while shoving her into a holding cell. Now here she sat, the embodiment of judicial authority, controlling their fate with a simple nod or gesture. "Yes, Your Honor," Barrett managed, leaning closer to the microphone. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his uniform collar. The defense attorney, Maria Rodriguez, approached the podium. She had witnessed Judge Monroe's wrongful arrest while driving past that night and had already filed a formal complaint. Now, she watched with professional admiration as the judge maintained absolute neutrality. Officer Reynolds, Rodriguez began her cross-examination. You testified that you had probable cause for searching Mr. Martinez's vehicle. Could you explain your criteria for establishing probable cause? Reynolds cleared his throat nervously, his eyes darting between the attorney and the judge. We followed standard department procedures for. Officer, Judge Monroe interrupted gently. Please answer the question directly. What specific observations led you to establish probable cause? The familiar words, so similar to what she had asked during her own traffic stop, hung heavy in the air. Reynolds' face flushed with recognition and shame. We observed the suspect acting nervously, Your Honor, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The gallery watched in fascinated silence as the scene unfolded. Court officers who had heard about the arrest stood straighter, watching their judge demonstrate the very essence of judicial impartiality. And these nervous behaviors, Judge Monroe continued, her pen moving smoothly across her notepad, were they documented in your incident report? No, Your Honor, Reynolds admitted, remembering how they had rushed through their paperwork that night, eager to mock their judge prisoner. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, though she could feel the tension radiating from the officers. Their discomfort was evident in every shifted stance, every averted glance, every stumbled response. The court would remind the officers, she stated clearly, that proper documentation of probable cause is essential for maintaining the integrity of our legal system. Barrett and Reynolds exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances. The word integrity seemed to echo off the courtroom walls. The proceedings continued, with Judge Monroe handling the case exactly as she would any other. She asked pertinent questions, made careful notes, and maintained absolute professionalism. Not once did she allude to their previous encounter. As the hearing drew to a close, she looked directly at the officers for the first time. Thank you for your testimony, officers. You are excused. Barrett and Reynolds turned to leave, their movements stiff and mechanical. One moment, Judge Monroe called after them. The officers froze, their backs to the bench. Please ensure that your body cameras are functioning properly for your next court appearance. The record should be complete. The significance of her words wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. 3 nights ago, these same officers had deliberately turned off their cameras during her arrest. As they hurried toward the exit, Judge Monroe's voice followed them. Court is adjourned. We'll reconvene after lunch for the afternoon docket. The gallery slowly emptied, but not before everyone witnessed an extraordinary display of judicial temperament. Judge Monroe had shown these officers not just the letter of the law, but its spirit. Fair, impartial, and blind to personal grievances. Outside the courtroom, Barrett leaned against the wall, loosening his tie. She could have destroyed us in there, he whispered to Reynolds. She did, Reynolds replied, understanding finally dawning. Just not the way we expected. Inside, Sarah gathered her papers, maintaining her composed expression. She had demonstrated something far more powerful than revenge. She had shown them what justice truly looked like, and that lesson would stay with them far longer than any punishment could have. 1 month after the infamous traffic stop, the Millbrook Police Department's main conference room was filled to capacity. Judge Sarah Monroe stood at the podium, addressing the assembled officers during their mandatory bias training session, a program she had helped implement following her wrongful arrest. Justice isn't about power, she began, her voice carrying the same authority it held in her courtroom. It's about responsibility. The badge you wear, Sarah continued, gesturing to the officers before her, represents a promise to the community. A promise that must be kept regardless of what someone looks like, what car they drive, or what neighborhood they're in. Captain Marshall watched from the side, nodding in agreement. The incident had sparked significant changes within the department. New protocols were established, body camera policies were strengthened, and a civilian oversight committee was formed, with Judge Monroe as a key advisor. Last month, Sarah said, her eyes scanning the room, I experienced firsthand what many citizens in our community face regularly. But today isn't about that night, it's about tomorrow and all the nights that follow. The young woman from the holding cell, the one arrested for shoplifting, sat in the audience. Sarah had reviewed her case and found irregularities in the arrest procedure. Now, instead of a criminal record, the woman was participating in a community program and attending college classes. Real change, Sarah explained, doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from understanding, from learning, and from the courage to admit when we've made mistakes. Barrett shifted in his seat, remembering his own transformed perspective. The past month had taught him more about justice than his entire career had before. Reynolds, beside him, took detailed notes, something he now did habitually, having learned the importance of proper documentation. Sarah moved away from the podium, walking among the officers. Your actions in the field ripple through our entire justice system. Every traffic stop, every interaction, every decision you make shapes someone's life. In the front row, Officer Chen, who had recognized her that morning in the holding cell, raised his hand. Judge Monroe, how do we balance maintaining authority with showing respect? Sarah smiled, appreciating the thoughtful question. Authority doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from earning trust. When you treat every citizen with dignity, you honor your badge and strengthen our community. The training session continued with practical exercises, role-playing scenarios, and open discussions about implicit bias. Sarah made sure every officer participated, creating an environment where difficult questions could be asked and honest answers could be given. As the session drew to a close, she addressed the room one final time. What happened to me that night was unfortunate, but it has led to something positive. We're building a better department, a better justice system, and ultimately, a better community. Barrett and Reynolds approached her after the session. Their demeanor was completely different from that fateful night. Humble, respectful, and genuinely changed. Your Honor, Barrett began, his voice thick with emotion, we want to apologize again, properly this time. Sarah raised her hand gently. Officers, your actions speak louder than words. Show me your commitment to change through your work in the community. Reynolds nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of her response. We will, Your Honor. We promise. As the officers filed out of the conference room, Sarah gathered her materials, reflecting on the transformation she had witnessed. The incident that could have ended in bitterness and recrimination had instead sparked real reform. Back in her chambers later that day, she reviewed the latest statistics. Complaints against officers down by 30%, successful community interventions up by 45%, and improved relationships between police and local residents. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Her clerk entered with a small stack of papers. Judge, he said, the first quarterly report from the Oversight Committee is ready for your review. Sarah took the report, noting the signatures at the bottom, including those of Barrett and Reynolds, who had volunteered to serve as department representatives. Looking out her window at the city below, she smiled. True justice, she had always believed, wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about transformation, about turning moments of darkness into opportunities for light. The sun was setting over Millbrook Heights, casting long shadows across the same streets where she had been wrongfully arrested. But now those streets were changing, one traffic stop, one interaction, one lesson at a time. Justice had indeed been served, not through retribution, but through reform.